跳岛的听众朋友们、观众朋友们，大家好，我叫李双志，来自于复旦大学德语文学专业。今天呢，我是在牛津大学，要在这里带着大家一起探寻大家非常熟悉的德语作家弗朗茨·卡夫卡的踪迹。卡夫卡1883年出生于奥匈帝国的布拉格，1924年在当时的奥地利首都维也纳附近去世。其实他终其一生都没有离开过欧洲大陆，但是我们今天却要在全英语世界最古老的一所大学里去寻找他。大家可能会问，他为什么会出现在这里？那么现在我就跟大家一起来慢慢的探索他的踪迹。我们今天知道的卡夫卡是全世界公认的现代主义大师，他的很多作品被人视作是现代人心灵的非常精确的写照。但是在他的一生中，他大部分时间都蜗居在布拉格古城的一个小楼里面。他的很多作品都是他偷偷的在阁楼上或者在这个自己的小房间里写下来的，而且他并没有想要把它们真正发表出来。我们今天能看到卡夫卡的许多作品，是因为他的好朋友布罗德背叛了他的遗嘱，让他的作品得以流传后世。我现在所在的位置呢，是牛津大学的威斯顿图书馆。卡夫卡生前的许多作品其实都没有发表出来，所以我们今天能看到的很多来自于他遗留给后世的手稿，也就是布罗德没有烧掉的那部分手稿。另外呢，还有很多他的书信、他的日记，这都是研究卡夫卡非常重要的资料，而这些资料大部分都收藏在这一个图书馆之中。卡夫卡生前发表的作品非常少，那我们今天能够阅读卡夫卡，能够了解卡夫卡的创作，很大程度上是因为有一代又一代的卡夫卡学者，全世界的卡夫卡学者，不断地从他遗留下的手稿里面整理出他的作品，还原他当时写作的历史现场。那今天我们非常有幸地来到了卡夫卡研究中心，这是牛津大学里面一个非常重要的研究机构，这里面有许多的学者依然在从事他的手稿研究，让我们能够更好的、更深入的去了解卡夫卡的作品和卡夫卡的人生故事。我现在所在的位置呢，是牛津大学的沃德姆学院。我们在牛津大学寻找卡夫卡，这是非常重要的一站，因为这里有卡夫卡研究中心主任 Carolin Duttlinger 教授他的办公室。我们接下来呢就会去拜访他，让他给我们介绍一下牛津大学和卡夫卡的因缘关系。Nice to meet you, Professor Duttlinger. It was really a great honor for us that we can interview you now. So Yeah, Professor Duttlinger, it's for me a great pleasure that you have time for this interview. We may start with this question. How did Kafka find a way across whole continent and across the Channel to Great Britain and to Oxford?
So this is a very interesting question. So you know that Kafka died quite young in 1924, and after his death, his best friend, a writer called Max Brod, he basically looked after his manuscripts and he started to publish Kafka's novels because very few of Kafka's texts were published in his lifetime. So Max Brod started to edit and publish Kafka's texts, but then, of course, the Nazis invaded Prague in 1939, and Brod fled from the city on the last train to leave Prague before the arrival of the Germans, And he took all of Kafka's manuscripts with him in a suitcase. And so he traveled out of Prague. He eventually traveled to the Black Sea. He took a ship across and he arrived in Palestine, so modern-day Israel. And he kept the manuscripts there until the Suez Crisis in the 1950s, when he was worried about the safety of the manuscripts, and then he moved them to Switzerland.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1960, one of Kafka's nephews, so the sisters died in the Holocaust, but the nieces and nephews managed to escape to the United Kingdom. And so one of these, the son of one of the nieces, he studied in Oxford. And at the time in Oxford, there was a fellow at Magdalen College called Malcolm Paisley. He was the fellow in German. And he was really one of the first Kafka scholars. So he was already working on Kafka in 1960. And he somehow found out that Kafka's great-nephew was a student in Oxford. And so he basically contacted this student, who was probably only 18 years old, and he said, I am very interested in Kafka. And so the student then put Malcolm Paisley in touch with his mother, a woman called Mariana Steiner, who lived in London. And they started talking. And so basically the nieces, the descendants of Kafka, they had all these manuscripts which were in Switzerland, but they didn't quite know what to do with them. So it's a very interesting story. Max Brod had offered the manuscripts to the New York Public Library. They weren't interested. The manuscripts were offered to the British Library in London. They weren't interested. And in the end, through Malcolm Paisley, they agreed to deposit the manuscripts in Oxford. So initially, it was just a loan. They were just to be deposited in the Bodleian Library. And then a few years later, they transformed this into a gift. So they basically gave the manuscripts to the Bodleian. But at the time when this was agreed, Malcolm Paisley happened to be on a skiing holiday in Switzerland. And so he simply drove to Zurich, he insured the manuscripts, he put them in the boot of his car, and he drove them across to England. And so that's how, it's not all of the manuscripts, but it's almost all of them are now in Oxford, which is, of course, very, very lucky for us. But it's also a very strange story.
Yeah, it sounds like a really very exciting traveling story, adventure story of the manuscripts. And I think the most of Kafka reader and Kafka scholars all over the world must be very lucky to have such a traveling story to Oxford.
Yeah.
And I suppose Oxford has now the largest connection of Kafka's manuscripts.
Yeah, that's right. So we've got 2 of the 3 novels. We've got America and we've got The Castle. We've got all the diaries. We've got most of the letters, and we've got all of Kafka's notebooks. So I would say we probably have about 90%, over 90% of Kafka's manuscripts.
Yeah, that's a very precious thing for a treasure for Kafka research. So you are also director of a Kafka Research Center in Oxford. Can you also introduce us this center? What is the work? What is the task?
That's right. So the center was founded in 2008, so 15 years ago, by 2 of my colleagues who thought, well, we've got all of Kafka's manuscripts here. We have some very well-known Kafka scholars. We have a famous university. We really should have a research center because, of course, scholars from around the world are interested in Kafka. But what do they do when they come here? They should have a place where they can come. They should have some sort of connection. And so they established the center, which has basically been organizing conferences and workshops. But also increasingly we want to raise awareness of Kafka among a general audience. And also increasingly, and ahead of the anniversary next year, we really want to talk about Kafka's global impact and what he means to readers around the world, not just academics, but people from all over the world, people from different walks of life, really.
Yeah, to this point, I really like to also introduce something from my country. Like in China, Kafka is really well known to each high school student because we have Kafka's Metamorphosis in the textbook of high school. So I think the most of them read this Kafka's work already in the high school. And I think it's not only in China, but everywhere in the world. Everyone who read Kafka must be very totally inspired by the story and also by the style. So I'm quite curious as a researcher, as an expert for Kafka, how you look at this phenomenon of global Kafka or global popularity of Kafka.
So it's interesting that Chinese students read the Metamorphoses at school. So it was also my first Kafka text that I read. I was probably about 17. So my friend was reading the Metamorphoses at school and she lent me her copy. And I remember being amazed. It was such a different story from everything I have read before. And I've read this story to my children. I think it's, in a sense, it's kind of like a fairy tale, of course, this story of transformation. In another way, of course, it's not like a fairy tale. He never gets transformed back. There is no happy ending, although maybe there is for the family. So I think it's a story that even though on some level it's difficult, it's also very accessible. You can read it and you understand what is happening. You don't need to know anything about Prague, you don't really need to know anything about history. I think it is a story that is very universal. It's about human experience, it's about family, it's about alienation, and that, I think, is one of the reasons why Kafka has continued to be so important for people from so many different places.
Yeah, not only from different places, but also from different time. Like the next year should be the 100th year after the death of Kafka. So, what are you planning to do as a Kafka expert, as director of the research center?
So this is, of course, going to be a big moment. It really is a once-in-a-generation moment. So at the center, we are going to organize a big Kafka exhibition where we will show the manuscripts that we have in Oxford, but we will also tell the story of Kafka's life. We will explain to people where he was coming from, what was Prague at the time. We tell the story of his family. We tell the story of his health and illness. So Kafka died from tuberculosis before his 41st birthday, so he was very young. And then we look at the different themes of his writings. We look at animals, we look at travel. There will be a case about Kafka's engagement with different parts of the world, including China, of course. And there will be a lot of emphasis on Kafka today and Kafka's reception around the world. And so for us, really, I think it's an opportunity to celebrate what Kafka means today. So, of course, we organize this as Kafka scholars. The texts are very important, but we also want to look beyond the texts. We want to look at artistic responses, whether this is in literature or in film, television, visual art, dance, music. So I think it's a really rich opportunity to bring together people who are inspired by Kafka today.
Yeah, it sounds like a very exciting event. And we really hope that we can also take part in that as a Chinese scholar for Kafka and also for Kafka reception in the world.
Exactly, yeah. It's very important to us to bring people from across the globe together to talk about Kafka.
Yeah, and to talk about Kafka, we have so many very precious manuscripts of Kafka in Oxford. And as a researcher, I may ask, what's the importance for you to read Kafka in manuscripts? Of course, we have so many editions, and you also mentioned Max Brod. Max Brod it was also one of the first editors of Kafka's works. But we all know there's lots of adaptations, adjustment from Brod, and now we have manuscripts. and we can make something new from the manuscripts. What's your opinion about the meaning of manuscripts for Kafka research?
So I think ultimately, if you really want to know about Kafka, you can't not look at the manuscripts. There is something almost magical about looking at an original page and to know that Kafka's hand actually touched this manuscript. So when I was doing my PhD, I came to the Bodleian to look at some of Kafka's materials. And I remember one of the things I read was the letter that Kafka writes to his youngest sister, telling her that he has tuberculosis. And it is an amazing experience to touch this letter and to think this is what Kafka wrote to his sister at the time. Mm-hmm. You know, the question, why do we need to look at the manuscripts? I think even the best edition can't reproduce everything about the text. So, for example, what did Kafka cross out? Where did he make changes? But also his handwriting. Did he write something quite quickly? So you can look, for instance, at the manuscript of the trial, and you can see that the first few chapters he writes very quickly. He hardly makes any changes. Mm-hmm. So you can count the number of words on the page, and it's like, let's say, fewer words on the page because he writes quickly. He knows what he wants to write. And then later on, the slower he gets, the more words on the page. And this is something you won't know if you just read it as a printed book. So I think, in other words, the manuscripts are about the writing process, and they are about the physical process of writing. And you can see that it's actually really hard work for Kafka to write.
Yeah, that's really amazing. That makes me also very curious to have a look into these manuscripts. And maybe we'll talk about Kafka later, also about this story of editions. But firstly, I will ask you as a professor in the university, because I have always students asking, which work should I pick as first reading experience for Kafka. So I think for lots of Chinese readers, when they start to read Kafka, which work will you recommend?
So, of course, The Metamorphoses is great. Mm-hmm. It's, in a sense, probably his most famous work. And it's not too long. It's got quite a clear structure. And you can immediately see what is special about Kafka. And what I would say is special is this combination of quite a disturbing story, which is told in a very simple way, very dry, very objective, very unemotional. So that is kind of what's fascinating about The Metamorphoses. If someone wants to get a very first impression, they could read this very short parable called Before the Law, where a man wants to get entrance to the law, but he is prevented by the doorkeeper, and he waits his whole life, and at the end he dies. And so it's only about a page long, but again, I have a memory of reading this story at school and being completely amazed, because at the end there's a big twist, which I won't give away. But I think it's a very nice story because it sums up Kafka's skill of surprising us.
Yeah.
So this is another thing I would say. And maybe my third tip would be to read The Trial, because it really is about modern life and modern institutions and authority and justice and guilt and so on. So it really is a novel which touches on so many themes. It's almost like it could have been written today, I think.
Yeah, okay. I think Kafka is just for every one of us, also for today. Maybe it's just like an eternal author. Yeah, and we can always get something from him, from his works.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, I've been reading Kafka for a long time, 25 years as a scholar, and I'm still amazed by new things that I can discover.
Yeah.
Partially because, of course, Kafka didn't write finished works. He was a very experimental writer. He started lots of stories that he didn't finish. So that's always very fascinating to me. Why does Kafka stop? Why does he abandon a story? Maybe after one sentence, maybe after one page. And why does he develop other stories? What is it about this story that works and another story that doesn't work.
Yeah, to this point, maybe we can also, or we should also use the manuscripts to get some answers from such a process of writing.
Yeah.
And especially why he stopped writing. It's just like a very important modernist writing issue. Lots of authors just didn't finish their works, but the unfinished works are still so exciting to read. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I have another question. So you are professor at Oxford in German literature, and what's experience with the British students reading Kafka?
So this is a very good question. Of course, in a sense, I have to think briefly because I teach them all the time, so I don't really stop and think about this. So I think our students, like all students, they are quite surprised. They find Kafka quite puzzling. So it's this mixture. On one level, it's very accessible, but when you start thinking about it, it's actually very strange. So our first-year students have to read a very dark story called In the Penal Colony, where someone is tortured to death. So it's
Very
about
cruel.
a horrible machine. So we introduced this story because it is also about colonialism, and we thought it's important to show that Kafka was also interested in colonialism, in oppression, in empire, and so on. So he was very aware of politics as well. So, you know, when the students study this, of course, they're still very young. I sometimes worry that they will find the story too disturbing. So we know that Kafka did a public reading of this story in Munich shortly after he wrote it. And it was a big scandal. So people actually left the reading halfway through. Apparently, some ladies fainted. So it was a really shocking, scandalous story. But the students are always fine. I sometimes think, should I warn them beforehand that this is quite a disturbing story? But I think they understand that the point of literature is not just to be pleasant and easy, but actually to challenge us in how we think about the world. And that, I think, Kafka certainly does. I think you can't read Kafka without thinking and without questioning your own assumptions. And I think that's why we keep reading him.
Oh, that's very interesting for us. I must also think about my experience with the Chinese students. Maybe the Chinese Great War is always the first connection, the first suggestion from my side. Of course, we can also discuss about this Chinese issue by Kafka.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting that we read the Kafka text from different point of views.
It's very interesting. I mean, talking about Kafka in China, of course, on some level, you could say Kafka never traveled to China. He knew a bit of Chinese poetry. He was quite interested in that part of the world. He read some adventure novels. And he once wrote in a letter, Im Grunde bin ich ja Chinese. So at heart, I am Chinese, which is an incredible statement. I always feel a little bit uncomfortable with this statement because you could say, this is cultural appropriation. You know, here is a German-speaking Jewish guy from Prague who says, I am basically Chinese. What does he mean by that? So I think nowadays we wouldn't say things like that, but I think what Kafka means is just a deep sense of perhaps fascination, perhaps affinity with China. And if you asked me why he feels like that, I mean, we don't really know, but my guess would be that the attraction for him of China is that it's completely different to Western European modernity. So Kafka wrote lots of stories about other countries that he never visited. I think the idea is always, this is the point of literature. The point of literature is to travel to places that we can't visit and to travel in the imagination. And I think for Kafka, China, it's sort of both different and familiar. So your students will know the Great Wall of China story is about empire. It's about authority. It's about the emperor being so far away that the emperor might have already died and people will never find out about it. So you can see here Kafka is working through the Austrian Empire at the time, which was also, of course, a colonial empire. And so Kafka uses China to reflect on his own contemporary problems, but he also writes about China because he is very attracted by this very different culture.
Oh, thank you so much that you explained the text or also the so-called Chinese complex of Kafka. I find it really inspiring. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Duttlinger, for this interview.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, and I really wish your center, Kafka Research Center, as well as yourself, a lot of success and happiness in the new year.
Thank you very much, and greetings to all Kafka fans in China.
Thank you. So maybe you can explain us also this book, and especially with these manuscripts.
Yes, so this is a reproduction, a facsimile of the first page of Kafka's last novel, The Castle. And what is very interesting to me as a Kafka scholar is the fact that Kafka actually wrote a different beginning first. So he tells the story of a man arriving in a village. So it starts the same way, but it's actually very different. So this man arrives in the village. He is greeted like a guest of honor. They show him to the best room. Then he starts talking to a maid. And then Kafka obviously decides, I don't like this story. And he draws a line. He abandons the story and he starts again. So this is, of course, what we've been talking about, this sense of stopping and starting, and Kafka giving up on a lot of texts. So he draws a line and then he starts again. And then he starts with what we know as the beginning of The Castle.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see.
And when you look at this, here someone wrote, here begins the novel The Castle, and this is Max Brod. So Max Brod writes into the manuscript with pencil, which of course for us today, this is basically a holy text. And the idea that Max Brod just took a pencil and writes into the text. But you can see it wasn't like that at the time. He was the editor. He had to turn this into a novel that he could publish. And as you said before, he made a lot of changes. Today, we would think this is wrong. But I think at the time, Brod's main goal was to make Kafka well-known. And so he had to publish these novels in a form that he thought people wanted to read. The other thing that's worth saying is that The Castle actually was a first-person narrative. So it starts off, it was late at night when I arrived. And then Kafka writes this for several chapters, and then he stops and he decides, no, this isn't right. I can't write this as a first-person narrative. And he goes back to the beginning and he crosses out every I and replaces it with K. But he doesn't make any other changes.
It's like also self-alienation from I to K.
That's exactly it. And I think it's interesting, the change happens in a very intimate scene. So Kafka probably felt, this is too personal, I need to distance myself from this story.
But then we have the most famous K figure in the world literature.
So of course K is fascinating. Is it Kafka? Is it not Kafka? Probably yes and no. But this is why you need to look at the manuscripts. You know?
Thank you. That's very inspiring.
You can also see he doesn't make many changes. So compared to a lot of authors who will change a lot, he sometimes changes a word, but he is actually quite confident. And it's a very clearly written text
it's
as
very
well.
tidy
You can actually
handwriting.
really read Kafka. If you speak German, you can look at this and basically read it.
Sometimes I have huge problems with the manuscripts from other authors. But like Kafka.
And then you can also, just to show you the very end. I probably can't find it now. I just wanted to show you. No, let me just look for it briefly.
Doesn't matter.
Well, anyway, you might know that Kafka just stops the novel. So he basically just gives up. So each of the three novels ends differently. The trial has an ending where Joseph K. is executed. America sort of just stops and The Castle just stops in the middle of a sentence. So Kafka just somehow couldn't carry on with it.
Yeah, but that's also very interesting work that you can always imagine how it could be ended.
That's right.
From your own
That's
imagination.
Right. And Kafka told Brod how he imagined it would end.
Oh, okay.
So apparently Kay would have just got very exhausted, and then he was dying, and on his deathbed he is told that he has been admitted by the castle, and then he dies. So it's a little bit like the parable before the law, except he sort of achieves what he wants before he dies.
Yeah.
But it's the same idea that death is the conclusion.
Yeah, but anyhow, I prefer to the open ending right now.
The open ending is, of course, more fascinating. Yeah.
So this edition is also a cooperation between the research center with manuscripts and other scholars.
So this is an edition that is produced in Germany by the editors Roland Reuss and Peter Stengle, who are based in Heidelberg. It's a very expensive project. It takes a lot of time to scan the pages and the transcription. But they come to Oxford maybe every year to carry on with the work. And when they come, we always meet up and talk about it. The problem is, of course, Kafka's manuscripts will not survive another 100 years probably. So it's very important to preserve them and to have a record. I mean, maybe they will, but you can see they are very fragile. They won't be around in 1,000 years, that's for sure. And so, of course, what do we do to preserve this amazing legacy, you know?
Yeah.
And this is an important step, I think. Most people will not want to read Kafka in this form. I don't think it's a reading edition, but it's certainly an edition that you can look at if you want to really know what Kafka wrote.
Yes, but it's also interesting to read such pages with this transcription.
Yes.
And it is also amazing enough. And of course, the handwriting is also interesting.
Exactly, it's very interesting.
Yeah, I think he has a much better handwriting than mine.
Yes, it's quite clear, because he's not writing for anyone, he's just writing for himself. But you can really read it.
Yeah,
So, but you can see he's still crossing out ich.
Some words.
Still ich and
from
K,
I to K.
So he's still writing as a first person.
在牛津大学寻找卡夫卡，我们发现了卡夫卡留给世间非常重要的、宝贵的遗产，这就是他的手稿。通过手稿的研究，我们能够知道更多卡夫卡的人生故事，知道更多他的创作。我相信，在卡夫卡离开我们的这100年间，世界纵然发生再多的变化，可是我们依然需要卡夫卡，需要去阅读卡夫卡。所以我们尤其感谢在牛津大学有这样的一批学者，孜孜不倦地通过手稿的研究，让我们能够获得更多卡夫卡给我们的启迪。